Elric Dane was the airline pilot everyone trusted, but behind the polished uniform and calm smile, he was hiding a dangerous secret, one that Sierra Lowell would uncover, setting in motion a chain of betrayal, obsession, and murder that no one could have imagined. Captain Elric Dane had built his entire identity around discipline, order, and the image of perfection. To those who worked with him, he was a man of few flaws. He walked through airports with an air of calm confidence, his crisp uniform always immaculate, his smile polite but never overdone. He had earned thousands of flying hours, and many younger pilots saw him as a mentor. To his neighbors in his quiet European suburb, he was the dependable family man who always waved when mowing the lawn, and who spoke proudly of his children's achievement. To his wife Mariel, he was the steady provider who never failed to send postcards from his international routes. Yet beneath this carefully constructed facade, Elric carried a secret that would eventually consume him. The double life began innocently, or so it seemed. Long layovers in American cities offered him time to explore, and in Miami, he found himself frequenting the same cafes and shops. The bustling city carried a different energy compared to the structured life he lived back home. It was during one of these layovers that he met Sierra Lowell, a catering manager who oversaw supplies for the very flights he piloted. She was younger, energetic, and impressed by his presence. He introduced himself not as Elric Dane, but as Adrian Vale. The name slipped easily from his lips, and with it came a freedom he hadn't realized he craved. As Adrian Vale, he was not a husband or a father, nor a man bound by decades of responsibility. He was simply a charming, worldly professional who could start fresh. Sierra was captivated. She lived in a modest apartment and spent most of her time working long hours at the airport. Meeting Adrian felt like stumbling into a dream. He was attentive, generous, and always full of stories about his so-called travels. She didn't know he was living another reality thousands of miles away. To her, this man was a chance at stability, love, and perhaps the family she had long imagined. In the beginning, Elric told himself it was nothing more than companionship to ease the loneliness of constant travel. But as weeks turned into months, he found himself looking forward to his Miami routes more than any other flights on his schedule. The adrenaline of deception was addictive. Back in Europe, Mariel noticed subtle change. Her husband was more distracted when he was home, more attached to his phone, and less interested in family routines. But Elric was clever. He bought gifts, booked family dinners, and made sure to attend school events with their children. On the surface, nothing seemed amiss. His long absences were simply part of the job, and Mariel had learned years ago that pilots often lived in two worlds, one in the skies and one on the ground. She trusted him, because for so long, he had given her no reason not to. What no one could see was the growing entanglement of lies. Elric rented a small suburban apartment in Miami, under the fake identity of Adrian Vale. He filled it with just enough furniture to appear lived in, while keeping it sparse enough that he could abandon it at a moment's notice. To Sierra, the place was their shared space, a sign that he was committed to her. For Elric, it was a compartment in his double life, separate from everything else, where he could shed the responsibilities of being Captain Dane and live in the fantasy of being Adrian. It should have felt like control, but in truth, Elric was slowly losing it. Each new lie required another to cover its tracks. He crafted false flight schedules for Sierra, invented family emergencies to excuse his disappearances, and even opened a small bank account under his alias to manage the money he spent on her. Yet, every time he returned home, he stared at his wife and children with a gnawing sense of guilt that quickly shifted into fear. He knew that one wrong move, one slip of the tongue, could expose everything. Still, the thrill of living two lives drowned out the risk. He convinced himself he was too clever to get caught, too experienced at managing details. He didn't realize that the very skills that made him an excellent pilot, precision, calculation, composure, were now being twisted into tools for deceit. And just like in the skies, where one small mistake could spiral into catastrophe, Elric's secret life was heading toward turbulence that no amount of skill could control. The affair with Sierra Lowell deepened in ways Elric Dane never anticipated. What started as a convenient escape during his layovers began to morph into a second life that demanded constant attention. Sierra had no idea she was in love with a man who was already married and a father of two. She believed Adrian Vale, as he called himself, was a dedicated airline professional who had never found the right person to settle down with until her. Each time he arrived in Miami, she prepared their small apartment with fresh flowers, cooked his favorite meals, and treated his arrival as if it were the most important day of her week. For her, every visit was proof that their relationship was real. For Elric, it was a carefully staged performance. To maintain the illusion, Elric created elaborate lies. He told Sierra that his work required him to travel extensively, which explained his long absences. He claimed that most of his family lived abroad, which excused why she never met them. He fabricated stories about an estranged brother, late-night emergency calls, and company obligations that kept him away. Sierra accepted these explanations, though sometimes with quiet unease. She wanted more, but she feared pushing too hard might drive him away. But cracks soon appeared. On several occasions, Sierra noticed documents left behind in the apartment, airline letters addressed to a different name, receipts that didn't match his story, and even a passport tucked into his bag with the name Elric Dane printed on. At first, she convinced herself there had to be an explanation. Maybe Adrian had a work alias. Maybe he was required to use a different identification for international travel. Yet the unease grew heavier with each inconsistency she uncovered. Her doubts reached a breaking point when she overheard one of his phone calls. He had stepped out to the balcony, speaking in a hushed but firm tone. She caught words like Mariel and the children. The names hung in her mind like poison. After he left for his next flight, Sierra began piecing together the truth. She searched through the apartment and found a small stack of letters hidden in his travel bag. They were written to Captain Elric Dane, filled with notes about schedules, pilot training, and company events. Her heart sank as reality crashed down on her. The man she loved was not Adrian Vale. He was Elric Dane, a married pilot who had been lying to her since the day they met. The discovery left Sierra reeling. Anger, heartbreak, and betrayal coursed through her all at once. She replayed every moment of their relationship in her mind. Every word he had spoken, every promise he had made. What once felt like a fairy tale now seemed like a cruel joke. She thought of the countless nights she had waited for him, believing he was working late, only to realize he had been flying home to another woman and 2 children. Elric sensed the shift immediately during his next visit. Sierra's demeanor was sharper, her words colder, though she stopped short of accusing him outright. He recognized the danger of the situation. If Sierra exposed him, his carefully maintained reputation would crumble. He tried to smooth things over with gifts and attention, promising her that their relationship was his top priority. But Sierra was no longer easily convinced. The more he evaded, the more determined she became. She started writing him letters filled with desperate pleas and threats. She warned him that if he didn't make a decision soon, she would contact his airline or even his wife. For Elric, the walls of his double life began closing in. He felt the pressure every time he looked at his family, every time he walked through the airline office where people trusted him without hesitation. The mask of control was slipping, and Sierra was holding the power to tear everything apart. The balance had shifted, and Elric knew what once gave him the thrill of living a double life now felt like a noose tightening around his neck. His secret was no longer safe. It had been discovered, and the consequences would be devastating if he didn't find a way to contain them. Sierra Lowell's discovery of Elric Dane's true identity transformed her from a hopeful lover into a volatile threat. In the days that followed, her emotions swung wildly between despair and fury. At one moment she wrote long, sorrowful letters begging him to leave his wife. And in the next, she composed sharp, furious notes threatening to expose him to the airline, his family, and the press. She began calling him relentlessly, sometimes in the middle of the night, leaving voicemails filled with accusations and ultimatums. The tone of her voice grew darker with each message. What once was love now sounded like a warning bell. Elric listened to those voicemails with a cold knot forming in his stomach. He could see the dominoes lined up in front of him, and if Sierra pushed the first one, everything would fall apart. His career was spotless. Passengers trusted him with their lives, and the airline relied on his steady reputation. His family believed in his integrity. Even his children bragged about their father, the respected captain, who flew across oceans. If Sierra exposed his lies, none of that would remain. His wife Mariel would leave him, his children would despise him, and his employers would see him as a liability. He feared not only disgrace but complete ruin. He tried appeasing Sierra with half-truths and promises. He told her he was arranging a separation, that divorce paperwork was complicated, that his children needed time to adjust. He convinced himself that if he kept her calm, he could buy time, but Sierra was past patience. She had sacrificed her heart, her dignity, and her future for a man who had deceived her from the beginning. She demanded action, not excuses. In one of her letters, she wrote that she was prepared to book a flight to Europe herself and confront Mariel directly. For Elric, the thought of his two worlds colliding sent waves of panic through him. The paranoia began to eat at him daily. On flights, he caught himself glancing at passengers, wondering if any of them knew his secret. At home, he avoided eye contact with Mariel, terrified she might detect his guilt. He checked his phone obsessively, dreading another voicemail or text from Sierra. Sleep became shallow and restless, haunted by the possibility of exposure. He grew irritable with his colleagues and distracted during pre-flight briefings. For the first time in his career, he felt his composure slipping. The situation escalated when Sierra reached out to the airline anonymously, leaving a vague message that one of their pilots was not who he seemed to be. The message was ignored at first, dismissed as the ramblings of a disgruntled caller. But Elric found out about it quickly. Sierra made sure he knew. She wanted him to feel the pressure, to understand she was capable of burning everything to the ground. That call was a warning shot. Elric's mind spiraled into darker territory. He began calculating the risks as if plotting a flight plan. What would happen if Sierra actually contacted Mariel? What would happen if she went to the media? The thought of facing humiliation was unbearable. He imagined losing not only his career but his authority, his respect, and the quiet suburban life he had spent decades cultivating. The life of Captain Elric Dane would be destroyed, replaced with the scandal of a liar and adulterer. In moments of desperation, he contemplated severing ties completely, disappearing from Sierra's life without a trace, but he knew she would never allow it. She was too determined, too wounded, too consumed by betrayal. Cutting her off would only provoke her further. He weighed another option, confessing the affair to Mariel before Sierra could expose it. Yet the thought of seeing his wife's face, hearing the disappointment in his children's voices, was unbearable. He told himself he could not survive that kind of shame. That was when the unthinkable began to take shape in his mind. If Sierra was the problem, then removing her was the solution. It started as a fleeting thought, a cruel idea that he quickly pushed away. But as the days passed and the pressure mounted, the thought returned, stronger each time. He began to see it not as an act of violence, but as a desperate maneuver of survival. He had mastered countless crises in the air, made decisions under life or death pressure, and always chosen the path that saved the most lives. Now he framed Sierra as the threat that endangered his family, his career, his very existence. Slowly, the idea hardened into resolve. He told himself it was the only way to preserve the life he had built. In his mind, it was not murder. It was control, the elimination of chaos. And with that rationalization, Captain Elric Dane began to plan the moment where he would silence Sierra Lowell forever. The night Elric Dane chose to act was humid, the kind of Miami evening where the air hung heavy, and every sound seemed amplified. He arrived at the apartment under the identity Sierra knew him by, Adrian Vale, carrying with him the charm she had fallen for. Sierra had agreed to meet him after a string of arguments and desperate calls. She believed this night would bring answers, maybe even the commitment she had been demanding. She lit candles in the small living room, cooked his favorite dish, and wore a dress he once said made her look radiant. For her, it was a final chance to salvage the relationship. For him, it was the carefully calculated end. Elric had rehearsed the plan in his mind with the precision he used for flight checklists. He would approach calmly, reassure her, and then act swiftly before she had time to resist. The thought sickened him, yet he carried it with a cold detachment, telling himself there was no other way. He had brought no weapon. He wanted it to look sudden, unplanned, almost like an accident. When he entered the apartment, Sierra's eyes softened, filled with hope despite everything. She spoke quickly, telling him she was ready to believe in him again if only he proved his loyalty. He nodded, smiled faintly, and told her he had made a decision. She led him to the bedroom, where she believed they would discuss a future together. The irony of her anticipation clashed against the weight of his intentions. As she sat on the edge of the bed, pouring out her heart, Elric moved closer. His hands trembled, not with hesitation, but with the enormity of the step he was about to take. He told himself it was necessary, that he was protecting his family, his career, his very name. And then, with sudden force, he pressed a pillow over her face. Sierra thrashed, her hands clawing at the air, kicking violently, but Elric held the pillow down with the strength of a man desperate not to lose control. The struggle lasted long enough for him to feel every second stretch into eternity. He tried to shut out the muffled gasps, the frantic movements, the reality of what he was doing. When her body finally went limp, the silence in the room was deafening. The candles flickered, the air conditioner hummed, but to him, the world felt hollow. He pulled the pillow away, staring at her lifeless face. For a moment, the gravity of his actions threatened to crush him. The woman who had once adored him, who had believed in a future with him, now lay dead at his hands. He forced himself to detach again, to push away. He convinced himself it was survival, not cruelty. The next phase was disposal. He wrapped her body in a heavy bedsheet, securing it with duct tape he had purchased earlier under the guise of routine errand. He lifted her with difficulty, the weight a brutal reminder of the life he had just ended. Carrying her down the stairs to his rental car, he kept his movements steady, his face expressionless, careful not to draw attention. A neighbor glanced briefly at him while watering plants, but thought nothing of the man carrying what appeared to be a large bundle of laundry. Elric drove out of the city into the swamplands, following a route he had memorized in advance. The roads grew darker, lonelier, the glow of Miami fading into blackness. He pulled over at an isolated patch, where the ground was wet and unstable. Mosquitoes buzzed in the heavy air, and the only sounds were the distant croaks of frogs and the rustle of unseen creatures. He dragged Sierra's body from the car and rolled it into the thick, murky water, watching as it sank beneath the surface, swallowed by the swamp. For a long moment he stood there, staring at the ripples fading back into stillness. He told himself the swamp would conceal her, that nature would erase his crime. He climbed back into the car, wiping sweat from his forehead, and drove away without looking back. By dawn he was showered, pressed into his uniform, and standing at the airport preparing for his next flight. Passengers boarded with smiles, unaware that the man greeting them with calm professionalism had just committed an unthinkable act hours earlier. In the days that followed, Elric lived as if nothing had happened. He laughed with colleagues, answered calls from his children, and sat at the dinner table with Mariel as though life remained unchanged. Yet beneath the surface, he carried the image of Sierra's last moments, buried deep within him, hidden like the body in the swamp. He believed he had solved his problem, eliminated the threat, and secured his double life once again. He had no idea that the silence he had forced would soon unravel everything he had fought so hard to protect. For several weeks, Sierra Lowell's absence went unnoticed by those outside her small circle. She often kept to herself, and coworkers assumed she had taken time off, or transferred to another branch of the airline catering company. Her landlord grew concerned when rent payments stopped, but it wasn't until a close friend reported her missing that the police began piecing together her last known movements. What they uncovered led to a trail more tangled than anyone expected. Detectives started with the apartment, where the faint smell of extinguished candles lingered. The place was tidy,
but carried odd signs of sudden abandonment. Sierra's clothes were neatly arranged. Her purse was missing, but her work documents and laptop were still on the desk. It looked as though she had left for an evening outing and never returned. When investigators interviewed neighbors, one recalled seeing a man carrying a large bundle from the building late at night. The memory was vague, but it was enough to raise questions. Who was this man, and why had Sierra vanished without a trace? As police delved into her personal life, they discovered a series of handwritten letters and saved voicemails. They were directed to someone named Adrian Vale. The letters were filled with longing, threats, and desperation. Some spoke of a future together, while others warned of exposure and revenge. Detectives now had a new focus: finding out who Adrian Vale really was. The name appeared nowhere official: no driver's license, no rental records, no social security number. But one sharp-eyed investigator noticed that Sierra's apartment lease listed a secondary contact number under a different name: Elric Dane. Cross-referencing the number revealed it belonged to a senior pilot employed by an international airline. The discovery sent shockwaves through the investigation. How could a respected captain be connected to a missing woman under an alias? The detectives approached cautiously, knowing the sensitivity of accusing a man whose career placed him in such a position of trust. They quietly tracked his flight schedules, comparing them to Sierra's letters and her phone activity. The patterns aligned with chilling accuracy. Each time Elric had flown into Miami, Sierra's phone records showed a flurry of calls and messages. Each time he departed, her messages became increasingly frantic. The investigators realized Adrian Vale was no lover from afar. He was Elric Dane, living a secret double life. The case took a decisive turn when search teams combed the swamplands outside Miami, acting on cell tower data that placed Elric's phone in the area. On the night Sierra disappeared, officers pushed through the thick marshland until they came across a disturbing find. Partially submerged in the muck, wrapped in a decaying bedsheet, lay Sierra's remains. The swamp had concealed her body for weeks, but not well enough to erase the evidence. Forensic analysis confirmed suffocation as the cause of death, and fibers from the sheet matched those found in her apartment. News of the discovery spread quickly. Elric, who was preparing for another long-haul flight, was taken into custody at the airport. Colleagues watched in disbelief as the uniformed captain was led away in handcuffs. The man they had admired for his discipline and reliability was suddenly exposed as a suspect in a brutal crime. Passengers waiting at the gate murmured in confusion, some recognizing him as the pilot who had greeted them warmly on previous journeys. In interrogation, Elric maintained his composure, but the evidence against him was overwhelming. Financial records linked him to the apartment rented under his alias. Letters from Sierra painted a vivid picture of their affair. The recovered body tied him directly to the crime scene. Prosecutors built a case that left little room for doubt. A respected pilot, desperate to protect his reputation and career, had murdered the woman who threatened to reveal his secret. The trial was a media storm. Reporters flocked to cover the fall of a man once seen as a paragon of truth. Mariel sat silently in the courtroom, her face pale, as she heard the details of her husband's second life and the brutality of his actions. She filed for divorce almost immediately, choosing to protect her children from the shadow of his crime. Elric's defense attempted to paint him as a man under unbearable pressure, but the jury saw through the arguments. They saw not a victim of circumstance, but a man who had coldly calculated the elimination of a woman who loved him. The verdict was guilty of murder, and Elric Dane was sentenced to life in prison without parole. The case became a haunting reminder that appearances can be deceiving. A pilot trusted with lives in the sky was revealed to be capable of taking one on the ground. His name, once associated with discipline and honor, was now forever tied to betrayal and violence. Sierra Lowell's story ended in tragedy, but her persistence in uncovering the truth exposed the darkness Elric had tried so desperately to